Hi, everybody. I'm Meg Mott. I teach politics at Marlboro College. I'm also the town moderator for Putney, which is, yes, Putney's in the house, I'm going to guess. And I am so delighted to be back here again. My first order of business, however, is to apologize for anybody who came expecting to talk about guns today. That is not the first thing that we're going to be looking at, although today we're focusing on capital punishment. But we will have a moment to revisit the gun debate just as we revisited the abortion debate 1 week later. So we will have some discussion about guns. The reason I changed the order is, well, one reason is I didn't look at my own publicity material. However, the deeper reason is I am completely possessed by this series. I spend a lot of time thinking about you all, the questions that you're asking, the courage that we're all taking in thinking about these difficult items together. So I am possessed by a daimon. That's what Socrates talked about when he said, why are you doing what you're doing? When the Athenians put him on trial. He said, well, I'm following my daimon. And I think there was something in me that felt after abortion we had to do guns. And I wasn't sure why. Why did I feel so strongly that after abortion we had to do guns and not do capital punishment? And it turns out my daimon was right. And part of that was reinforced at Jill Lepore's discussion that guns and abortion have been key wedge issues. They are emotionally charged. And for people who heard her, did you love it that she said, constitutionally weak? We know that. So here are these two wedge issues in which there's a reason why they have been paired. So we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about that. And then this one on capital punishment, when I first started, I thought, oh my goodness, this one's going to be a super hard one. Well, the state of New Hampshire has done a lot of work for us recently, and so now we're going to be able to look at their good clash. And I think there really is some good clash happening in New Hampshire, and maybe get some ideas on how was it that New Hampshire was able to successfully debate this and bring out the issues and then end up with a resolution that we can live with. Maybe that's what I want to say. When there's a good clash, it's not that we won. It's that everybody can live with. And these are hard issues to do that. So for people who are new, and I know there's one person who's new in the audience, but maybe a few others for this series. All right, good clash. The very first step is, anybody remember? Listening, exactly. Remove hands from ears. And that's all you need to do. So you know you're in a bad clash because you just feel like, I gotta get like this. But if you can take your arms down, your hands down, then you're going to be in a better position. So here's Jill Lepore's explanation for those first two. I thought this was so fascinating. My chart looks a little different. That actually is supposed to be a slightly different color. But if you're on the left and you think about guns, it symbolizes murder. If you're on the right and you think about guns, it symbolizes freedom. And we certainly got that when we were working on this last week. The idea of guns is a lot about liberty. It begins with this notion that only tyrants disarm their subjects. A cool king will allow their subjects to have guns. And then Machiavelli takes it the next step. In fact, if you allow your subjects to have guns, they stop being subjects and they start being partisans. So liberty is a big piece of the gun debate. And if you're feeling distressed about guns, you're going to see you're going to think about the murder. And then we move down to abortion. Abortion on the left symbolizes freedom. And we got at this last week, and I'll go over the 7 points that we made on both sides of the abortion debate. For the left, abortion is a lot about the right to choose, right over one's body, equalizing the circumstances, and for the right, it symbolizes murder. So isn't that amazing how these two things fit together? And we actually have a lot in common, right? Similar texts, similar words, very, very different interpretations. So the second step of good clash is to then be willing to sit down with people and talk about it, and to weigh and consider the different options. So you consider the various arguments, and you also, and here's the key piece, you recognize when you're having cognitive dissonance. I'm so glad Amr is here today. He and I have been teaching a class that looks at cognitive dissonance using the book that we were using in the first couple of classes, Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. And this idea from Frantz Fanon that when you have two ideas, and one of them is the idea of yourself, and the other idea comes in and challenges that primal idea of yourself, you're going to experience cognitive dissonance, it's going to be incredibly painful, and you may want to do this. So, but that's going to be part of the job, is to really be thinking about how it's affecting us emotionally. So last class, even though we were focusing on guns, I was thinking we would take a week to stew and marinate with the different arguments. So I gave you a very difficult task, and everybody responded, I thought, amazingly well. The game was you had to come up with the same amount of reasons for as the same as reasons against. So it was a test in could we actually weigh and consider the various arguments. Women's lives became precious, and that is on the side of keep abortion legal. Maybe you'll recognize your comments. The Roe decision defined legal life. Abortion bans, somebody said, were against common good. So that it was a law that this person felt was so extreme prior to Roe that it was against the common good. It wasn't just for women, it was against the common good. Roe regulated safe abortion procedures, gave women rights over their bodies, equalized the consequences of unwanted pregnancy, and finally, created more public health awareness about reproduction. So is there anything here that people feel like we missed?
Does that mean you only abort little boys?
And what, David?
Does that mean you, number one, means you only abort little boys?
So women's lives became precious. I think that was for the pregnant woman. So these are all the arguments for that we found, not necessarily that everyone agreed with, but that people would find to support the Roe decision. And I'm being very specific, and I want to make sure that this really gets addressed in the last class, if not a little bit now. When I'm talking about we're looking for arguments pro and against these issues, I've decided to really focus on the decisions, because that gives us a common text, even if we don't have common ground. So these were all, so if women's lives became precious, that was an argument for a pregnant woman, that her life became precious. Yeah. Anything else people wanted to add to this side? Because then we're going to do the part that oh yes, Sheldon.
The economics of it.
The economics, okay.
It's legal, it's cheaper.
Uh-huh, yes, okay. So somebody, and is there anyone here, this is the tough thing, Sheldon, is there anyone on this side that you might get rid of in order to put in an economic argument? I know I put you on the spot, Sheldon.
Are 1 and 5 the same thing?
So you could say 1 and 5 are the same thing and pick one of those, and then we could put Sheldon's in.
Is that possible?
Yeah. I mean, that seems like people are nodding a little bit. Yeah, so Sheldon, you may be able to get yours in. I won't change it on the screen. Thad.
Well, the economic thing is obviously whether government should fund should at all do things like push for planned, things in foreign countries. I'm trying to get to the point, but it is that there are a lot of places where the United States refuses to help.
To send money.
With,
Uh-huh. So Thad, am I right in saying that you may be interested in Sheldon's piece about getting something about economics in here? And if that required reducing those too, that would be fine. Yeah, Charlie.
I think the economics argument could be on both pages because there's multiple aspects to it. For example, gun owners don't want to give up things they've paid for. The cost of abortions are changing from the private sector to the public sector. So if we're going to put it here, we need to put it on the other.
On the other side. Okay, and Charlie, I'm going to use that as a reason to segue to now we're going to, in order to do our good clash, we have to be able to do our 7 on the other side. And this is what we came up with. And we can see if there's any we can collapse. All life is precious according to legal, moral, and theological authorities. And I know I was giving people a hard time. I was like, somebody said, well, Jesus said you can't have abortion. And I said, well, you got to be a little bit more specific, because I don't know if Jesus said that. But if you can find something in Scripture, and it usually is about all life is dignity, or all life is precious, or God is made in the image, man is made in the image of God, and therefore all life is precious. So I didn't want you all to think that I was against theological authorities. But I'm picky. I want you to be precise when you make that kind of a claim.
So is that all life? Is that human life or all life?
So this is the abortion kills children side, so this would be against the Roe decision. And an argument that we found that was important on that side is that all life is precious, not just women's life.
What about human? I mean, other animals.
Yeah, so then you could expand that to my chickens.
And what about plants?
And my ducks. And the baby goats. But you don't want to hear about that. You don't want to hear about that. Right, so you could, but what we have right here, for this purposes of this, I'm going to assume, well, I shouldn't make any assumption, that it was human life. Another argument we made on this side that was problematic about the Roe decision was the Supreme Court ruling was too wide. Too broad, and it was anti-democratic because it's an anti-democratic institution. Yeah, David.
I just have a problem with the authorities things. Legal is in writing, decided by legislators.
Or Supreme Court justice.
Theological is what theologians discuss. But moral is based on millennia of human experience of what the outcomes can be. It's not just some authority saying so.
Right, right. So maybe custom is what you're understanding. Tradition and custom would be moral. And this was taken from the crowd, so you'll have to dispute it with your fellow OSHR people. Yes. So that's good. We're getting ready for some good clash. We also wrote down that it attacked the value of a new person, was an argument against Roe. Denied the rights of a potential person. Ignored state sovereignty. And we said Roe relied on weak constitutional reasoning. It was reading a lot into the Ninth Amendment. Was it pulling a rabbit out of a hat? I don't know. And one of the problems was abortion became used as contraception. So those were 7 things that we put down as arguments worthy of our attention, may not agree with them, but plausible for abortion. And if we wanted to get what was Charlie's recommendation, that we put something else that had to do with the costs. I want to make sure, Charlie, I get what you're saying, though.
I'm saying, well, previously abortions were paid by the people that needed them, or their significant others. Now we're talking about funding it through insurance programs and stuff like that, and publicly, which gives a lot of people pause because they feel like they're paying for something they don't afford.
Exactly, yeah. So did everybody hear what Charlie said about that? Yeah, if you have to pay for something you don't believe in, that really hurts. It's one thing to have it available. So is there anything here we'd want to, Judy?
I just wanted to comment on the economic issue. issue also that there is an economic impact for illegal abortions as well, with
Right.
resulting medical problems.
Right. Alice?
On the other side, relative to economics, oftentimes the non-aborted child is born into poverty, and there is a huge social cost of having children in poverty.
So Alice is talking about the huge social costs of when children are unwanted children are born into poverty. So I'm going to hold us now on the abortion debate, but and Janice, because you had your hand up before.
I don't know why I didn't realize this last week, but I have trouble with the word precious. To me, precious, and I just looked it up, and it does mean something, means an object of great value. But to me, precious is a diamond or, jewelry, or, I don't know, is precious the word that is used in this document?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so maybe, in fact, this was, I was thinking of wearing this last week or the week that 2 weeks ago, because red flowers, I think they're roses, life is precious, is a bumper sticker for abortion. I'm sorry, for pro-life, anti-abortion. Thank you. Yeah. So, but the key piece is we're starting to engage in what I would consider good clash, in that we're thinking about arguments, we're realizing there's good arguments on both sides, and then we are beginning to weigh and consider. And then we also have to, the next step is begin to notice in ourselves when our deepest values are being challenged. So I'd like to take a little bit of time just to grab maybe 6 or 7 arguments for Heller, for gun rights. So can we do this? Come up with equal number of arguments for gun rights, and I'm saying Heller because the law of the land right now is one that says that self-defense is a fundamental right. That's what they established in Heller, with certain restrictions. So it's not an absolute right. Neither was Roe an absolute right. It's a expanding of rights with certain restrictions on it. So this is like pop quiz. Do you have a plausible argument for gun rights? Anybody? I'll take one. Peter.
Am I wrong that the original idea was partly so that a tyrannical government could not take over?
Yeah. Oops, this isn't good. Let's do this one. Scares tyrants?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do we have another? Because remember, how many you put here? Julie.
Hunting is a valid behavior in many ways, not necessarily all.
Yeah. Michael.
Yes, self-defense for individual and family.
Yeah. This was a really big one for the Heller decision. So big that in the McDonald decision, it became a fundamental right. Self-defense and includes family protection. Charlie. Farming. Julie? Yeah. I'm sure, Charlie, we have many things we could talk about. Yes, Judy.
I just wanted to say, somebody said self-defense for family. Did you add possessions? Did I hear you say possessions?
Oh, okay. I'm gonna protection of possessions. I think that's a different thing. Protection of. Oh, sorry. Protection of property. Yes, Steve.
I suppose it's just an expansion of the scares tyrants, but it isn't really about scaring tyrants. It's about the need for revolution, the rights of the people to change their government.
That's the we the people argument. Change government. Yeah, because there is no actual right to revolution in the Bill of Rights, but there's rights to assembly in the First Amendment, and then right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, which makes revolution seem, yeah. Any others? We're up to 6. I can fit one more. It will, yes.
Can you clarify why farming?
Charlie, do you want to explain the farming?
Well, most people don't deal with it, but you wouldn't have vegetables on your table if somebody wasn't dealing with the varmints that want to eat them before you do. There's slaughtering of animals for the meat that you want to eat.
That's constantly.
No, not, sometimes I don't know if I should tell you about my life on my farm and what happens to baby goats, because you all are enjoying the cheese, and you probably don't want to know about, anyway, yes.
I was wondering if you could combine farming with protection of property.
Okay, so those two could get combined. Yes, and can you tell us your name?
Leanne.
Leanne, thank you. And Judy, you had your hand, oh no, it was Julie, sorry. Did you have your hand up? Yes.
Certain kinds of recreation, for example, skeet shooting, target.
Sports, so should I add it to that one, Julie? Because remember, every time no, it's different. Okay, people are saying it's different. So it's going to be number 7. That means, Judy, you're not going to, what's yours?
Well, I was going to say that hunting, protection of property, and farming all sort of come under basic subsistence.
So I'm going to say that I can add what can you say that one more time? Sports?
Recreational uses.
Yeah, recreational use. Okay.
But was that used in the, in presenting the Heller?
That's a good point. Myra's saying, given the fact that we've narrowed the issue to Heller, there's some things here that maybe will be less relevant, although, or at least to support what that finding was. And I've got several hands up. Marion and then Janice.
I would consider economics again. If I have a wealth of thousands of dollars invested in my gun collection, are you going to take that away from me?
Right. So this is another way of understanding. There's the gun to protect the property, and then there is this, what do you mean you're going to confiscate my weapon? Why should you take my property? Yeah. I'm sorry, I had 2 hands up, and then I'm going to go to Sheldon.
I have a question.
Janice, yes.
So with regard to scared tyrants, I'm thinking about the amendment. Isn't it really about more protection from the government, from a tyrannical, protecting yourself from a tyrannical government?
Yeah. So that's why scares tyrants is protection from, and this one that Steve talked about, we the people, is the right to.
Right.
Yeah. And Mary, you had your hand up, and then Sheldon. Mary, did you have a hand up? Yes.
Well, I really think protection of property implies shooting at or scaring away people. And you use a completely different kind of weapon to get rid of varmints. And I really think those are 2 different things.
So you want to keep them separate? Okay. I'm going to say this is now contested. Great. And Sheldon?
I was going to say that collecting guns becomes like a hobby.
And so does that mean that do you have a quibble with one of these, or?
It's different. It's like collecting stamps. People have.
Like a hobby. And maybe it doesn't need Second Amendment protections or something, or, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to move it over just so that, because we need to get to capital punishment. So what are the plausible arguments against gun rights, which is against the Heller/McDonald decisions? Do you have any arguments against what the Supreme Court did? Judy?
The abuse of the right.
Can you say that again?
The abuse of the right to own a gun.
One. Abuses personal right?
Open to
Well,
abuse.
when I'm thinking of somebody who is using a gun for unauthorized purposes like murder or robbery or things like that. So it's abusing the right to own a gun is what I'm trying to
Yes, and so this is a right that could easily be abused, right? And we can also, this is where when we go back to the abortion thing, we'll see, oh, is that a right that could be abused? So this right, one, it abuses right, Second Amendment right. Yes. Another plausible arguments against, Pat.
It's too wide. It allows you to have automatic
too broad.
Yeah, so the AKs and all that could be problematic. We had Wesley and then Sheldon.
Maybe this is too simple-minded, but guns are dangerous.
People are agreeing. Okay, guns are dangerous. Yep. And Sheldon, did you have your hand up?
The weapons today, is what the other two have just said, are not the same as 230 years ago.
Outdated ideas.
So, should you want me to put that down as number 4? Remember, we're going to start to run into numbers, or can it be glommed onto one of the others? Too wide, too anachronistic, or no? Would that get counted, Sheldon? Maybe. And there was a hand up right behind Sheldon.
It makes it too easy to take your own life.
Suicide issue, and we talked about that. Makes it. Somebody said something right over here. No. Okay. I feel like I missed one. What did you say, Michael?
Well, I thought about the time, that is centuries-old idea.
Yeah.
Regarding, but, weapons.
How about if I say guns today are too dangerous? Is that going to get this piece in? Is that okay? Somebody going to take a friendly amendment? Guns today are...
Not the original intention of our...
They're inherently dangerous.
All right, are inherently dangerous. Okay, Mary?
Wouldn't it be different if instead of the heading, plausible arguments against gun rights, said plausible arguments for regulation of gun rights?
Right. And the thing is that I'm pushing on this. Mary asked the question, and the way you frame these questions is everything. And I'm taking this interesting approach, and people could disagree with it, which is to look at what a decision has done from the Supreme Court, because they are the original framers. And as long as the population at large wants to change things, they need to address the law as it's currently done. So there's a lot of leeway for regulation in Heller. There's a lot of basis for state regulation, even in McDonald. And this is where I'm pushing people to really think about the law. When we get into our wedge issues, remember, high emotional, weak constitution, which means we may see a decision like this as, oh my God, look what the Supreme Court just did. They have now made it impossible to regulate guns. In fact, that's not what happened. But that's the rhetoric you'll hear. And I think a similar thing happened with Roe. That actually there were a lot of restrictions on Roe, but it got presented as these absolutes. And that's when you can count on us getting totally divided from each other and getting super polarized. Nancy had her hand up.
It's become politicized. I think candidates are being judged now upon their opinion about gun rights. I'm not sure I know if that should be its own category.
Yeah, and Nancy, I'm tempted to put that there because I think you did something last week around abortion and so other people did around Roe. It's become one of those hot button issues that it just takes over the whole conversation. We can't have good clash about it. And is that because it went through the Supreme Court and not through the states? I don't know. It's a hypothesis. Joel, yeah.
This is sort of on the guns are dangerous. I mean, I think they're intrinsically dangerous, but there's an argument that the possession of guns endangers collective security, and that government has the right, in fact, the obligation to protect that security, like, for example, having stop signs and red lights, which do violate the right of drivers to do whatever they want with their cars.
Yes, yeah. So part of government's obligation is to prevent risks or, reduce risks. I'm piling things up. How many did we do last time? 6? We went to 7? We almost went to 8. Okay. That means we have 2 more. Who are those 2 people going to be? And you're the one with the laptop open. Okay, go ahead. He's keeping track of things, and then I'll go to... Yes, Larry.
So I think
this is related to suicide, but the availability of guns in a home makes the likelihood of escalation of domestic violence to the use of a gun.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Related to suicide, it's bigger.
Yeah. So we have the suicide issue. Do we want me to? You want me to add domestic violence here, or do we want me to give Larry? Because there's something kind of big missing here, people. I just want you all to know. So do you want me to add? I could put it down here. Domestic violence. What?
Domestic violence is against someone else. I think it should be said.
Okay. DV risks. All right, now that means there's one more, and if you don't give me what I'm looking for, I'm going to make squeaking noises. Who do I ask? Okay, you think you got it?
No, difficult to regulate.
What is difficult to regulate?
Enforcement. Guns, the possession of guns. There's a huge black market. People own guns illegally, then illegally probably.
And that is similar we talked about with abortion. Difficulty with enforcement. It didn't make our list, but difficulty of enforcement. So that means we just hit 7. We missed the rational. What were you going to say, Doug? I know you've been like popping your hand.
Maybe that was covered already.
Yeah.
Promotes the notion that violence or war, violence of any kind, is a solution to conflict.
So, sorry I didn't make the list. Violence can't be. So just to remind us of what our. So Heller, I think we got Heller's, which is on this side, in which. Self-defense. We also got Otis, which was self-defense. Here are some others that came from the state of Vermont. And we got this in the other side of guns are too dangerous. They just shouldn't happen. People can abuse those rights too much. And we also got Mr. Machiavelli. Hey, that's very good. The pieces that I was wondering about is, doesn't government have a rational basis to make certain laws? And so sometimes if we can frame it, we got it with Joel's thing around protection. Governments have this obligation. Governments do regulate. And maybe I just wanted somebody to say city or government or something so that we understand these actors matter, as opposed to just social groups or individuals, but actually government is got to have a big role there. Cities have the right to regulate dangerous activities for the public good or something of that sort. Okay, we're going to move on to the 8th Amendment. I'm starting with law because we may not have common ground, but we do have common text. And these texts are the ones that help us figure out what's lawful and what's not. Somebody want to read the 8th Amendment?
Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted.
Thank you, Myra. And that's a pretty sweet amendment in terms of interpretation, as opposed to the second, which had all these moving parts, and we had to look at it from a variety of ways. And yet there's still a gray area, such as?
It's excessive.
What is excessive? Right. What is cruel? What is unusual? And once again, we go to the Supreme Court, who starts to figure this out. But they always look at the rest of the Constitution to figure out whether capital punishment, say, is cruel or unusual, or it would not be a fine. So those are the two terms they're going to be looking at. And so they would always ask the question, does capital punishment show up here besides the 8th Amendment? Does anybody know the answer?
I don't think so.
Of course they did, said Joel. We could go no further than the 5th Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Turns out they may have done some amputations back in the day. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that shows up again in the 14th Amendment. So no due process not to be deprived of life or liberty without due process of law. So it was hard baked in to the Constitution, capital punishment. We'll get a little broadening of the discussion with Max Weber, wise man. Does somebody want to read what Max Weber had to say?
The state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's what a state is. And the key piece is legitimate. So in a constitutional democracy, legitimacy is determined by the people. And many of you all, we've had conversations about state power, and Vietnam War comes up. I would say the state lost legitimacy because the use of force lost popular goodwill. I'd make a similar claim for police brutality, that when these cases get more and more into the public domain, who's at risk? The state. Because this all depends on using your force legitimately. And the same could also be said about capital punishment. If the population at large believes that that is a legitimate use of violence, you will see it happening. And if the population at large says no, then it stops happening. And in the United States, we've gone through quite a sea change. So I don't know why. I was looking online for charts. Most charts start in 1930, counting the number of executions. Obviously, there were executions before 1930. One of the first executions in New Hampshire was in the 18th century. It was a woman who was accused of murdering a child who was who was dead at birth. And she was executed and then was exonerated. A little too late. But yeah, so it's kind of interesting that there have been a lot of executions in the United States. And in 1930, that's where you start to see them being counted. This number over here on the left is 200. So our high water mark is 200. And you can see it goes, I don't know what was going on then. Many of you may have some explanations for this. Too bad Jill Lepore isn't here. She could probably tell us what was happening on all sorts of different levels, popular culture, etc.
Those are desperate times.
Desperate times. There's 200, and then it starts to go down, and spikes up and down. But you can see there's a trend to 1965, 67, 68, and then it's flat from 1970 on. So there's no executions going on in the United States. The law hasn't changed. The 8th Amendment hasn't changed. The 5th Amendment hasn't changed. And the 14th Amendment haven't changed. So it's just something else is going on. The state stops executing people. And then in 1972, there's a Supreme Court case, Furman v. Georgia, in which a young man, during a burglary, his name is William Henry Furman, his defense attorney said he did not have an education past the 6th grade. He had emotional issues. This was evidence presented at the trial. But during a burglary, and the facts are, I saw different facts on this case. In one set of facts, he had been surprised during the burglary. He tries to leave. He falls, and the owner of the house is killed accidentally. In the other, he shoots through a door, and the resident dies. But he's brought to trial, and after a one-day trial, not only is he convicted, but he's also sentenced at the exact same time, and he was sentenced to death. So he appeals, and the question is, does the death penalty violate the cruel and unusual punishment clause? As with other cause cases, we talked about Norma McCorvey. Lawyers are looking for good cases, and they felt that Furman made a good case because, first of all, he was of what do I want to say? He was undereducated. He had emotional/mental issues. Also, he clearly did not intend to shoot the person, and that the jury had not only convicted him but sentenced him all in a day. So this was the kind of case that lawyers are looking for, and they took it to the Supreme Court, where this group of people had to decide what the Eighth Amendment would allow. So this is, I don't know if there's another one in this category, but Furman v. Georgia, every single justice wrote their own opinion. Yeah. Brown versus Board of Education, everybody got on board the one opinion. But this one, and I, you know, again, you could have all sorts of speculation. What's going on? Douglas writes the opinion for the court, and he says, somebody want to read this?
The Eighth Amendment must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society.
Yeah. Can you keep going, Nancy?
It may be considered unusual if the application discriminates against him by reason of his race, religion, wealth, social position, or class.
So Douglas takes the unusual word, and he says unusual is when it's only hitting one group. They didn't put disproportionate back in the Constitution, so unusual. And then this one, the evolving standards of decency, this gets to what David was talking about earlier. Like, what is moral authority? It goes on a long journey to determine what are the morals. And Douglas is saying morals evolve. So if you have a maturing society, for those of you who read Hegel, it's like a little Hegelian moment here, that we get every day and every way we get a little better and a little better, and so society has evolved, and for that reason, the death penalty should not exist. It's no longer constitutional. Then we have Brennan's argument, and Brennan is, at this time, the only Catholic on the court. He was also, you may remember, in the Roe decision, he worked with Blackmun to say, don't just do 3 months, give women more rights up until viability. So using Catholic social thought, he was able to make an argument that allowed for women's autonomy up into the fetus being able to be viable outside of the womb, and he felt that that was consistent with Catholic social thinking. And then he also makes this case on the death penalty. Somebody want to read Brennan?
Death is an unusually severe and degrading punishment. There is a strong probability that it is inflicted arbitrarily. Its rejection by contemporary society is virtually total, and there is no reason to believe that it serves any penal purpose more effectively than the less severe punishment of imprisonment.
Right. And if you could keep going one more.
The death penalty does not comport with human dignity.
Yeah. So both Brennan and Douglas are saying this is no longer moral. We can't make this argument. And Douglas makes the other argument, it's unusual because only certain classes of people are regularly executed. There was another argument, this was also part of the majority, which I'm calling the freakish imposition arguments. And Potter Stewart, whose son practices law, I think, still around here. He retired? Okay, rumor has it. Does somebody want to read Potter Stewart's argument?
The Eighth Amendment cannot tolerate the infliction of a sentence of death that is so wantonly and so freakishly imposed.
Right. I mean, because you remember, right? It was hardly being imposed at all. So wanton suggests a lot, but he's saying that it doesn't actually get done that much. And then does somebody want to read Byron White?
The penalty is so rarely imposed that the threat of execution is too attenuated to be of substantial service to criminal justice.
Yeah, so the justices are looking at the deterrence argument. If the numbers have dropped as low as they had dropped, it's not serving a deterrence anymore. And so the lack of executions is, for these two justices, enough to say, we need to stop doing the death penalty. Yes, Amr.
I think it's a take on unusual in a really cool way.
Yeah.
And it's so unusual as to be of no help.
Yeah. Everybody hear Amr, that's so unusual, it's of no help. If it was usual and would-be criminals were thinking about the death penalty seriously, then it would actually be helpful. But at this point, they can't see that.
Isn't there an argument for having more executions?
So Joel is pointing out, and this is going to be important because I didn't go into too big of the weeds right now in terms of what happens, but these two justices and one other, they flip sides when another case comes up 4 years later. And we'll see did you see how it went back up again? Yeah, so, but before we start to talk about it going back up again, there was another big argument that was made on behalf of the court. So that's arguments against capital punishment, and that was from Thurgood Marshall. And I call that one the sacrificial lamb argument. Does somebody want to read Marshall?
Capital punishment is imposed discriminately against certain identifiable classes of people, usually the poor, the illiterate, the underprivileged, the members of the minority group, who become society's sacrificial lambs.
Yeah, and that's a big term, right? A sacrificial lamb, it means this is one of those ideas that societies, when they can't deal with their cognitive dissonance, they find something to take out. They find a scapegoat, a sacrificial lamb. And you can see why the Furman case was important, because William, I think his name is William Furman, the young man, 26 years old, he was underprivileged, he was illiterate, he was poor, and he was a member of a minority group. And Marshall uses, he's got pretty good evidence to back him up. Of the 3,859 persons executed since 1930, so again, this seems to be the year where they start counting. He breaks it down for us. 1751 white, 2066. He uses the term Negro. 32 women, 3827 men. Of those, 3,334 were for murder, and 455 were rape. These numbers are really fascinating. Number of whites who were executed for murder and for rape. And then look at these numbers. Right. Yeah, so one of the concerns, and that for people who are concerned about elements of the Me Too movement and other concerns about rape laws, this is part of our history that some people want us to remember, that rape laws have very much disproportionately affected men of color. So when we talk about strengthening those laws, that's sort of something to keep in one's head. And just so you can see what the population actual distribution is, it doesn't go back to 1930, but the blue at the bottom is the number of African Americans. So those numbers were for 9.8% of the population, getting as high as, at the time of the Furman case, 11.1. So truly disproportionate executions for certain crimes. But not everybody agreed with Douglas, Marshall, and the other people writing in favor of the court. Here are the dissents. One is Berger. Somebody want to read that one?
Punishments are only cruel when they involve torture or lingering death. Within that boundary, the decision belongs with the legislature.
Thank you. Yeah, and can you remind me your name? Diane? I'm sorry I didn't get you. I knew you had a hand up earlier. I'm looking for you next time you got your hand up. So here is this notion, and then we talked about this last time. I mean, shouldn't these decisions be dealt with by legislatures and not by the courts? Blackman who wrote Road. Somebody want to read this one?
Cases such as these provide for me an excruciating agony of the spirit. Still, the state legislatures should decide.
Yeah. So Blackmun holds, and this he said this before Roe, so this is 72, 2 years ahead of time. Obviously, this is an emotional issue for the justices, and yet some of them are thinking this really should not be coming through us. This is something the states should decide. If states want to repeal their death penalty laws, that's what the states should do. And then there's this one, which is a direct attack on Thurgood Marshall. Somebody want to read Justice Powell?
We are not yet ready to condemn and upset the result reached in every case of a Negro rape defendant in the state of Arkansas on the basis of broad theories of social and statistical injustice.
And this becomes very important for two reasons. One, it's another way of stating we're going to let the states handle this. And in fact, most criminal law happens in the states. So the fact that the Supreme Court is going to throw out all these state laws, it is a big deal. But notice how he really focuses on the notion of the Negro rape defendant, that statistic that Marshall brought to our attention. And the idea that we are not going to throw out these injustices based on social and statistical reasoning, social theory and statistical reasoning, is something the court has done reliably. So every time there is an effort to say that the criminal justice system has been systematically attacking or discriminating against poor people, people of color, this court says, you have to prove motive. We're not going to solve this on statistics, so we're not interested in your statistics. Marion?
This is more of a question, and that is, how much or when did the science of analyzing DNA kick in, and how much of an influence has that had on this?
So Marion asked, when did DNA evidence come out, and figuring out how some of these cases were wrongfully decided? I actually don't know that year. But Marion, let's hold on to this, because I think a future slide may answer, or at least show us when it starts to become a problem. But I want to stay with Furman right now. This is a big decision, 1972. All of these death penalty statutes are now thrown out, but they are given some ideas on how to reform them. So it's not as if you cannot do death penalty, but the way Georgia has been doing death penalty, especially with the same jury just convicting and sentencing, no, we're not going to do that anymore. So they started to make some changes. But after the Furman, this is probably one of the most radical things that ever happened after a Supreme Court decision. 35 states enact new statutes with reformed death penalty provisions. So the states did not hear this news and then say, okay, fine, nope, 35. And so that they would be able to maintain the death penalty. This is what it looks like now in the United States. I think it's 30 states that have death penalty. Red is death penalty. Blue is no death penalty. And purple is when, I think it's governors have declared a moratorium. So, and California is pretty recent. That's a new decision. And purple is when the governor declares a moratorium on death penalty. And that's just what happened in California.
Bypassing the legislature.
And so yeah, Shoshana, did you want to? I'm sorry, I want to make sure, because were you guys saying Vermont has no?
No, I missed New Hampshire for.
Yeah. So I'm glad. Thank you for drawing our attention over there. So you see our little red state in New England. There's New Hampshire. Right. Okay. But Myra, did we answer your question?
The question is, the governor's ruling, does that bypass the legislature?
So Myra's asking, when the governor declares a moratorium, does that bypass the legislature? I think so. I think that's what Gavin Newsom? Yeah, Gavin Newsom did. Now, I suppose that there could then a state legislature could then do something against it, but governors have a lot of authority because they have that right to pardon. So that's something the executive branch has.
Well, the other thing is that it can be put back on the ballot for people. And we've had a tremendous amount of that related to lots of issues.
Right.
So that it's not always executive privilege. But
Yeah. And you're Jackie, right?
I am.
Yeah, so Jackie is reminding us how another way to take care of this is you put things on the ballot. And so there are ways where the people are able to push something forward, which is always a little dicey, right? Because you never know how it's going to go down, like Prop 8 in California in 2008? Yes.
Or the next governor, Newsom, couldn't he just change it?
And right, and Philip,
Like
right,
Trump
exactly. Philip is reminding, it's Philip, right?
Yeah.
Is reminding us that how easy, if you put power in the executive branch and then you have somebody new in that office, it can go the other direction. So it's not as stable as having it in the pure blue if you are against the death penalty. So let's look at what happened in terms of this. I showed you one graph, but this is 1977 to 2017. It goes a little further. And you can see how it goes up, 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 and then it starts to go down. I think Marion's point about DNA evidence showing, oh yes, Susan Hesse.
DNA was first used in a criminal case in England in 1986, and it was first used in the United States in 1987.
In 1987, and can we see?
Yeah.
Yes. So DNA evidence starts to happen here. Now it still goes up, but you know, it could be that more cases become exonerated. People begin to get more and more worried about mistakes. Talk about cognitive dissonance. We want to believe our justice system is not making that kind of a mistake because that's on all of our citizen souls. So as that evidence comes out, perhaps, you know, that may be one of the reasons why it goes up. I think the high water mark is 99.
It was also challenged. The admissibility of DNA evidence was challenged.
Larry is saying that the admissibility of DNA was challenged, you know.
That began right away.
And that began right away. So it had a slow start. Yeah,
That
great, and important.
1999 is the one that it peaked so high? Is that-
Yes.
Yes,
What was going
99.
on then?
I don't know. Yes, Steve.
The thing that was striking for me in your charts of the two arguments was that except for the fact that the Kahn argument referred a lot to states' rights, that unlike the previous situations, there was very little, nobody's talking about the Constitution. And any of those arguments are mostly, certainly pro ones, are moral arguments, with no mention at all of that what the Constitution says. That was surprising.
So did everybody hear, Steve, that these arguments, again, there's not a lot of constitutional reasoning going on, at least, and especially, I didn't give you everybody's words. I was pulling out what felt like what were their high points, but I still think that Steve's observation is correct, with the exception of the word unusual, that began to be understood as not being used very often. So Joel had said, well, isn't that an argument for having more executions? It appears that people decided they were going to avoid the unusual problem by having to normalizing executions. But in terms of cruel, that's a word that's going to oftentimes have moral overtones. So Brennan, I would imagine that Brennan would say he was making a constitutional argument based on that word cruel, and Douglas was doing the same thing, and he said we used to think something was cruel or was not cruel, and now we think that same thing is cruel. But you're right, there's not a lot of big reasoning going on here. Thad?
Two things. The big difference now is the actual definition of class, in that we've ruled many times now on what age we should allow people to be executed and what IQ they should have. And then, of course, we get into the famous O.J. Simpson trial, which really played a lot into this because of the DNA thing. But the outstanding part of the class that I discovered is that in California, a woman or wife, if you kill them, you get life in jail or something, 20 years or whatever. If you kill a police officer, you get executed. So there is a class.
Yeah. So one of the things that in the next Supreme Court case, and we won't go into that, that's Gregg v. Georgia, the Supreme Court made the death penalty permissible if any state was able to define the nature of the crime, so was there torture, the type of victim, so if it was an officer of the law or a judge or member of a jury, that would also trigger the death penalty. And then the third was the background of the person who committed the crime. Did they have a lot of priors? So they began to, in the next case, carve out a little space. I'm thinking it's 11 o'clock, and maybe we'll take a quick little break, and then we're going to go back to cognitive dissonance and what happened in the state of New Hampshire. Yeah. So here is, a couple of people came up and noticed that why is it spiking? Clinton does the crime bill in 1994, and this is, as some were pointing out, this is his administration, and being tough on crime was a key element for Clinton. So is that part of it? I don't know. I mean, it's just part of the mix. But we are now going to turn away from this. And just remember, this going back to the second class, that capital punishment is one of those issues where people tend to form very strong opinions and then not be able to talk to each other. So when this book first came out, which I think was 2005 or 6, something like that, they described an experiment that social psychologists had done. And they took a random group of people that was random only in the sense that they didn't know who the people were, but they knew that there were some people who were strongly for capital punishment and some people who were strongly against it. They gave this group of people, we looked at this I think in our second class, 2 scholarly articles. Oh look, my machine, does it work? Ah, magic. Turns out you plug in something. Things always need a plug-in. Who knew? I asked it nicely, but it needed a plug-in. So 2 scholarly articles were distributed to a group, one in favor, one opposed. And one would think, well, if people were thinking rationally, keyword here, they might have moved into the middle, because these scholarly articles gave evidence in favor of capital punishment deterring crime and evidence against its ability to deter crime. Did they move to the middle? No, they didn't. Nope. Not only did each side try to discredit the other's argument, they also became more committed to their own side. So these wedge issues, we can begin a conversation and feel that we are open and we've taken our hands off our ears, and when the conversation starts to get emotional, we will become even more convinced that we're right and the other person is wrong. You can count on it. That's the species at its greatness. So given that capital punishment has been one of these hot button issues, and maybe this is just another reason why my daimon said, Meg, go to guns, wait on capital punishment, wait to see what New Hampshire's doing, because they're going to give you more evidence about how something that was not able to be a good clash became a good clash. And so then we can analyze it. In 2018, maybe, do we have people from the Granite State in our audience? Yeah. I would hope so. Oh, okay, but maybe somebody from the Granite State feels all alone in Vermont, because, you know, we were talking about how partisan politics in Vermont, Windham County is a little bit on the partisan side. Sometimes a person needs to just, you know, duck and keep themselves. And then we saw the blue-red with the death penalty states, so New Hampshire and Vermont have different stands on that. In 2018, the New Hampshire legislature, which just switched to, I think, Democratic majority, repealed the death penalty. And Chris Sununu vetoed. There he is. And this is what he said. And this is a strong argument to make against the death penalty. Somebody want to read Chris Sununu?
While I very much respect the arguments made by the proponents of this bill, I stand with crime victims, members of the law enforcement community, and advocates of justice.
And just so that everybody, if you don't know, there is one person on death row in New Hampshire for slaying a Manchester police officer. And so when Sununu is saying this, he's got somebody very specific in mind, a very specific law officer, and he also has a very specific crime victim, the widow and family of the slain police officer. And oftentimes, this is when the argument gets framed as, I stand with victims. And that is a very, very compelling argument. Whenever you want to make a strong case for a law, you stand with the victims. And people have a very hard time saying, well, actually, no, not necessarily. People, yeah, Joel.
Standing with the victims means what exactly? With their right to vengeance?
Joel is saying, so what does it mean to stand with the victims? Could it be their right to vengeance? Judy?
In preparation of today's class, I researched the meaning of punishment.
Yeah.
And one of the definitions is retribution, the other is retaliation.
So Judy was saying, Judy's doing her homework. She's coming very prepared and has done to see what are some of the definitions of punishment, and retribution and retaliation is definitely part of it. For people who are doing work in restorative justice, scholars of restorative justice, they've come up with a way to begin to understand this. If you're involved in the restorative justice movement, you generally want to come up with a process that is oftentimes perceived as kinder to the person being charged. But the restorative justice scholars also say we want it to be perceived as kinder to the victim. The way Sununu has framed this, and I'm not just, if Sununu is not alone in making this case, this is oftentimes how it gets framed. So I wanted to show you some other ways to think about death penalty or punishment in general. And one is thinking about it through the victim interest, and the other is through citizen interest. Victim interest recognizes the desire for vengeance, and that's a human desire. I could imagine there are many instances I would want to take somebody's head off, and if somebody didn't stop me, I might take somebody's head off. The farm lifestyle, you have some weapons. People beware. And here's another key piece about thinking around victim interest. There is an understanding, and this has gotten, I would say, stronger over the years, is that it's therapeutic. That to be able to have a lot of support for wanting vengeance or wanting to seek punishment or feeling safer, that this is part of that way of approaching the problem. There's a personal sense of justice. And this is why now many prosecutors, more so than when I first started doing paralegal work in the early 80s, victim impact statements have become more and more important. That was something that the Crime Bill and the Violence Against Women Act of Bill Clinton really gave victims a chance to talk about how it affected them. And that was understood as perhaps wanting vengeance, perhaps that this would be more therapeutic to have this opportunity. I'm not disputing this at all. I'm just saying this is a world view, and that it's a personal sense of justice, that the victim is not left out of the legal equation. And this is key, that there's moral authority in suffering. So if you are the person who has been affected by the crime, oftentimes it's framed that you have a greater moral authority. And there's legitimate reasons to make that claim. There's another way, though, to think about this, and this is more in terms of citizen interest, as if the victim is, yes, a citizen first and has been victimized second. And under that one, justice interests are not only for themselves, but for offenders and for the wider society. There are victims of crimes who are interested in a more just end, not just for themselves and their family. And this is not easy, cannot be easy. It must be terrible in the circumstances where you really want to take somebody's head off to say, for society at large, this is the justice I wish to have. Rather than being therapeutic, I call this formal, where you're understanding the form itself is going to provide the social healing. This is a new idea. Well, this is an old idea that's not getting much traction anymore. So Myra, I can always count on you. I so love it that it's like, what does that mean? So for me, formal, there's formal procedures in court, rules of evidence, that sort of thing. Who can say what, when, the many rights that we have in our Constitution to protect the accused in terms of right to remain silent, etc., right to a jury trial, not that that's happening much anymore. But I understand formal as creating a form where people understand themselves as part of the whole. And that's what makes me so sad to think we only have one more class together. Because one of the lovely things I get to do here is say, did everybody hear Myra? Did everybody hear Julie? Did everybody hear Thad? And that to me is a form where people are speaking, they're thinking out loud in public. The last class, Nancy, there was this moment where you were wrestling. Was it on the pro side or on the con side? Or was it an effect? And I said, let's think with Nancy. And I felt everybody do that, thinking through this problem. That to me is a formal, it's a form. We have created a form. We've created an expectation. We're allowing each other to speak. It's different than therapeutic, which tends to be private. So I'm still working on the vocabulary. People can come up with some other term, but therapeutic is oftentimes how victim interests are presented, and that's what Sununu did. And formal is we're also first citizens. So that it's a social sense of justice or a procedural sense of justice and the moral authority through the law. Which is another reason why I keep pushing the law as creating a form for us to share some common texts, share some common procedures, and this gives us a sense of being citizens and primarily in relation to each other. So that's probably my biggest hypothesis that I just that I'm presenting. Yeah, Philip.
I'm really against the death penalty, but as I look at those two things, the first one is much more riveting and emotional, and the other just feels abstract.
Yes. Right. So everybody hear Philip in terms of this one we get. I mean, that's a story. That's got pain and suffering. And this one it can feel so abstract. I think that's absolutely right. And formal, what an abstract term that is. Yeah. Thad, and then Joel.
This actually gets into thinking psychologically how people think. And that is the famous thing I bet other people have taken in their moral classes or whatever, where they have a person up on a bridge and they have a choice of hitting a switch that will kill two people, but save three by having the switch go.
The trolley car.
But if you're on the tracks itself, would you push those two people onto the tracks? And the same goes for the death penalty. It changes somewhat when people say whether they actually want to shoot the person in the firing line with a single bullet to get revenge. It kind of changes there. So there is this edge.
Right. So Thad is talking about there's in the abstract thinking about there's this famous trolley experiment. Do you try and kill two people, or do you kill 5 people? You have to make that abstract decision. And then when it actually is about doing harm to somebody directly, like saying, pulling the, Judy found a great passage. Can I read that? That this was from Game of Thrones. Basically, the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, of bringing it down to the very physical, the psychological. In some ways, that's what Georgia jury did, though. It was the same jury that convicted for him. Somebody else had their hand up, and I forgot who it was. It was Joel, and then,
I just I'd like you to clarify the victim's interest argument, because I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, is the presumption that the logic of this is that the victim actually should determine the sentence him or herself, or even carry out the sentence him or herself?
Yeah.
Is that argument frequently made, or is the argument simply that the victim should have some input, or that the victim's feelings should be taken into account? It's all
Yeah. So Joel's piece about this is like, how does this emerge? Where does this come from? I see this clearly in what Sununu said, I stand with victims. And that oftentimes this is what, when we had some horrible, horrible murders in the 90s in Vermont, and there was a lot of some of our laws got much stricter, criminal laws, and it was because of speaking this term of the victims. We need to stand with the victims and make our laws tougher. So that's oftentimes a rhetorical framework that's used. Amr had his hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's going to be useful or not, but just bringing in this idea of justice and looking back at it, I'm always reminded, Meg, of this notion of justification in religious terminology, this making things right, feeling out of kilter, and then there's a desire to be made right. And in that way, one framework that I'm seeing over here is that the victim interests can be seen as a kind of religiosity that is very charismatic, that wants expression, so the kind that is ecstatic almost, speaking in tongues or breaking out, which has its own form, as we know that even this one has its own form in which you perform this. And the other one is where we associate with more ritualistic ones in which you go, we know everybody is going through the interior process, but it's being regulated by somebody in the front, there's ways of behaving.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. You're saying that, Amr, makes this one for me is the Orestes, the trilogy in which Orestes is running from the Furies, and it's the vengeance cycle. But there's also enormous amount of sense like, I'm going to kill this person, I'm going to feel better, and the moral authority is through the suffering, and so you could just feel the revenge cycle in the Orestes cycle happening. And over there, I see Athena. The citizen's interest. The form is the temple. And she tells the Furies who are so angry, okay, we're going to give you a place. It's not as if she gets rid of the Furies. They have this little spot in the temple, but they're contained. And the work of the society is the temple itself. And that's going to be much more rational. So that's how I understand that. And I've got lots of hands up, but I'm going to let them go because they're important, these hands. Yes, Pat, and then Larry, and then Jen.
Well, I'm just wondering, I'm seeing under citizen interests, and no one has mentioned this, and I don't know the specific cost, but I'm wondering if there isn't a financial aspect to this too. And whether many of our fellow citizens don't make their decision based on how much it costs.
How much it costs to have
have a person put to death.
the death penalty.
In jail. I think
Yeah.
it's a reality that many people who aren't
Right.
thinking deeply upon it or affected
Right.
personally, I think that plays a role.
So Pat is mentioning, and because here we have two kinds of arguments, one which is more formal, legal, and the other which is more emotional and based on suffering. And Pat is wanting to just move beyond these two and say, well, okay, couldn't we just argue this in terms of dollars and cents?
I think many people do.
And they do for the death penalty cases. Though, at least in New Hampshire, as we're about to see, it wasn't about economics. It was these two frameworks going at each other. And an interesting switch starts to happen. But I want to see what Larry and, we got Larry, Janice, and then Alice. Yeah.
So I think it's worth pointing out that the victim's interest is a little misleading, because the victim's dead. It's the victim's family's interests that are being considered.
Yeah.
And they may not represent the victim's feelings. We consult the victim.
Yeah. So Larry's saying for capital punishment cases, although some of those cases may be for rape, as we saw. So, but that many of them are for murder, and so the victim is there by proxy. Family members usually fill in that proxy. So, but Larry just wants us to point that out, that in these specific cases, there oftentimes the victim is dead. Janice, and then Alice.
I think it's presumptuous to expect that all victims are going to share the desire for vengeance and feel that having somebody put to death will give them a personal sense of justice. Their religion, you think of those churches that were bombed and the African American children that were killed, and that community coming out and not asking for vengeance. You know, and there are always examples, you hear this all the time, where the parent or the person that's left behind speaks out in asking for mercy or whatever. So
Did you all hear?
I hate to think that that's all we are. Is,
right. So
vengeful.
So Janice is talking about how for victims, vengeance is not necessarily what is going to be their response. There could be mercy, there could be forgiveness, and that's going to be important when we get to the New Hampshire example, that it gets framed often in these ways. And so there may be a group of people who want to stand with victims who are making these kind of claims. Alice, you've been so patient.
There's the Innocence Project. That's one thing. I agree with the economic bit, that it costs an awful lot to go through the criminal death penalty. And third, we mentioned the making of right, or omoponopono in the Hawaiian term. So that has to do with restorative justice.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and for anybody who didn't hear Alice, that there's three things here. One, I just forgot number one. The Innocence Project. And there's many of them around. Currently I have a student who's in LA who's working at the Loyola Project on Innocence. So a lot of work is being done to exonerate people who are on death row or to get people who are serving life sentences or who have been wrongly convicted out of jail. And then there's also the economic of all of this and how often that again with Pat is looking at, could we go to that framework as a way of starting to solve this, how much money it costs, and just do it in dollars and cents. And then the third one, oh my gosh.
Making right.
Oh yes, how can we make right? So that's a great segue for us. How to turn this now to what did they do in New Hampshire? Because they had this opportunity. Sununu repeals it, but they come back again in 2019. Death penalty repeal 2.0. And here are the arguments in favor of repeal. We've heard this one before. Many people made this argument. It's interesting. I didn't find the economic argument. What I've heard was the justice argument. Disproportionately affects people of color and the poor. So people are seeming to gravitate to more justice-centered arguments for this particular issue. And then there was this amazing senator, Ruth Ward, who, just as Janice said, has a very different way of understanding what it means to be a victim. Janice, do you want to read what she said?
Senator Ruth Ward, Republican, whose father was killed before she was 8 years old, quote, "My mother forgave whoever it was, and I will vote in favor of this bill."
Yeah. So there we have somebody identifying as a victim saying, I'm going to support this because if my mother could forgive whoever killed my father, I can forgive. We don't need to have a death penalty. Then there was this argument from a libertarian candidate, not an economic argument. Somebody want to read this one?
The more and more experience I had with government, I concluded that the general incompetency of government didn't make them the right people to decide like that.
Yes, okay. That's classic New Hampshire. I lived there a long time. I have a lot of love for the state of New Hampshire. And that is exactly a libertarian argument. We make mistakes. I mean, that's something he's suggesting there. Government can make mistakes. We don't want to make that kind of mistake. So there's another person who voted for the repeal. Arguments.
Doesn't the jury make the decision, not the government?
Well, actually, I don't know because some of these go to judges because people don't go for a jury trial. It depends on what the state law requires. I think in many of these places you have to go to a jury trial for a death penalty case. Still, he thinks that That the whole process he's suspicious of, the whole apparatus. But here we have the argument for victims, and this is, again, I'm calling this a victim interest argument. And Senator Sharon Carson, in the Senate, New Hampshire is a very small Senate. There were very few senators who voted against the repeal. And she said, for victims, the death penalty is justice. And she quoted this widow of the slain police officer, Michael Briggs, "It's not about an eye for an eye or revenge. It's about protecting our society from evil people that do evil things."
So that takes it away from the vengeance.
So not vengeance, because my sense is that vengeance is not, what's the word, politely accepted anymore. The whole idea that, I'm forgetting his name, the guy who wrote a lot about scapegoats, he said that envy was an unacceptable emotion, and rather than deal with envy, you would find a scapegoat. Rene Girard, is that? I believe that's who it was. Anyway, but here we have the idea of, she knows vengeance is no longer politically palatable. It might have been okay in the 90s under Clinton and the Violence Against Women Act, and vengeance might have been a politically okay thing to do there, but clearly it's not anymore. It's protecting the innocent. And this is the way to do it. And finally, here's another quote that I just thought, this is so perfect for us. Senator Harold French, a Republican, and this is what he said. Somebody want to read his?
As I get older, I realize for a fact that we're actually all on death row. It's just a matter of time before our names get called.
Yeah, can you keep going, Elizabeth?
Yes, when my name gets called, I'm going to go before the Lord with a huge basket full of regrets and misdeeds, just like you will.
Yeah, so noticing his mistakes.
But I tell you, what won't be in that basket of misdeeds. I did not turn a deaf ear to those who came and took the time to speak to us to get rid of the death penalty.
Yeah, so a lot of people who may have been for the death penalty, after there were more hearings and more people came out, and people who had been victims of crimes spoke out against it, and people said the government should not be making this because basically they're incompetent. My favorite kind of argument. I don't know. I'm not really. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of government and law, but I liked that that was his argument, and really getting at the humility of trying to make these kind of decisions. So it was overwhelmingly, which means veto-proof, voted to repeal the death penalty in New Hampshire. My guess is Sununu will probably veto it, but they have enough for a veto, so it will be a formality. Yeah, so yeah, that's what just happened in New Hampshire, and maybe it's like, what made that a good clash? Or I'm presenting it as a possible example of a good clash.
Because people on both sides spoke up.
So yeah, both sides, both people spoke up, says Lynn. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Well, they didn't just speak up, that they were heard.
Yes, yes. People felt heard. And it gave people an opportunity to really talk about something hard and be heard.
Well, I noticed that the Republicans often do you think who for the death, or actually the ones advocating against the death penalty.
Yes. Right, and that was very important, what Michael just said about that there was many Republicans who ended up speaking on behalf of the repeal. So what does that do for the community at large? To begin to say, wow, arguments can be made that aren't going to just fall on party lines. Does that mean that people in New Hampshire may be more willing to listen to their Republican counterparts or their Democratic counterparts? I want to go back to that map that I showed you all from the second week, in which partisan politics, like what does it look like in New Hampshire? Is it less partisan than in Vermont? I don't know. Steve?
Two thoughts. One is that this speaks to the question of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
That it's a matter of what he's explaining is that he was able to listen to something that would have been dissonant for him. the ability to face cognitive dissonance. But I wanted to stick in a little thing. You used the word proxy before.
Yeah.
And I think once one starts saying proxy, so the family victims are a proxy for the person who was killed. But isn't the state a proxy for everyone? Isn't that what government is?
Yes.
Government is proxying on a giant scale.
Yes, yes,
And,
right.
and maybe these arguments lead one to say, well, justice is a bad idea. Justice is really a proxy for revenge, no matter how much you've hidden it.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Did everyone hear what Steve was saying about how, yeah, proxy, this is a problematic term if we're just saying family members can be proxy. And I thought, you know, maybe where you're going to go with that is that family members are so victimized. I mean, it must feel so direct. But proxy for government, that actually makes a whole lot more sense. The government acts on our behalf when it kills somebody. The government acts on our behalf when it puts somebody away to protect us, right? It's going to be for our good.
I don't mean just act on our behalf, but in the Oristaya, there's something about, Clytemnestra actually says, Agamemnon's blood is calling out from the ground, and that she is acting as a proxy for a dead person. And what I'm suggesting here is that that's what government does certainly in death penalty cases, but in many cases, government is acting as if it were speaking for a very small minority.
Yes, yeah, right. And if it is, am I right in your feeling that the government is doing that when it's executing somebody?
Yeah.
Is it engaged in the same sort of being driven by, I love this thing, Agamemnon is dead and his blood is calling to Clytemnestra and she's going to take it on. And we could see that bloodiness when the government executes somebody. Do we also see that bloodiness or that kind of passion when the government provides a safety net? A social safety net. And what does that look like? I'm wanting to think about...
But the ultimate libertarian argument to say government is really pretending to be everybody, and actually, psychologically, it is being a proxy.
Interesting. Yeah, so that might actually be an argument for, okay, government, don't execute so many people, but don't create a social safety network. Yeah, interesting. Sheldon and then Judy.
Interesting support for this discussion comes from the movies that have been made about the capital punishment. But one that's not well known in the States was made in France about 80 years ago, and it translates its title as it deals with capital punishment. Its title is "We Are All Murderers."
So We Are All Murderers, a French film made in, did you say the 80s?
80 years ago.
80 years ago.
1938.
Okay. Wow, interesting. A film maybe to look at. I thought there was another hand. Judy, yeah.
Just as Steve was speaking, I was thinking about how circular this is, because the government as a proxy, well, the government is we the people.
Right.
So.
So Judy's asking about this thing about government as proxy, and this is next class. One of the things I want to do is situate, where is we the people, where is the government, where are all these individuals, where is the clash happening? Some would argue that we the people is this, so it's above the government. It is an abstract, but in other ways, a metaphysical being that controls the whole thing. This would be Rousseau, who would make this kind of a claim. And why do I even bring that up? It's that, for me, and this maybe goes back to what Amr was getting at, how is it that we can be in the clash and have a sense of what our side is and how important our side is and how much is at stake in our side, and what part of our brain can also be part of the big container that holds the whole picture? And a good clash can go back and forth. So for when... is the Orestes thing working for people that people know this play of it's just one family member killing another family member? It begins when Agamemnon wants to go to Troy and he kills Iphigenia in order to get the winds to go in the right direction. So then Clytemnestra gets mad, and when Agamemnon comes home, she kills him, and then Orestes, the son, gets mad, and he kills the mother, and it just, it's going and going and going and going. And that feels to me to be like part of what we're grappling with when we're talking about capital punishment, in the sense of how can we break that cycle, and then what part of our brains needs to get out of vengeance and the pain into the larger picture to do that. Sorry, I know I'm going on too long. Lynn and then Peter.
I'm just suddenly struck with that oftentimes the issue decides where you're going to stand. For instance, in abortion, you hear life is precious.
Yeah.
But if you come on this, you don't hear life is precious for the person who's being executed.
With the exception of William Brennan. So that was his argument, that life is precious, human dignity means that we cannot kill somebody. And he did not feel that way about early term abortion. So that's how he was able to hold those two ideas as, yeah, right. Pairing these all together gets different parts of your brain activated, right? We had Peter, yeah, and then let's.
I think in the government's interest, that is a question I have, is to put someone dangerous in jail is both a deterrent and for the safety of society, and I understand that. I've always understood the death penalty to be argued as a deterrent, but that woman from New Hampshire talked about taking somebody who's already in jail and killing them as something that would make society more safety. Is that actually an argument people use?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. A fear that if you don't actually kill them, they will get out one way or another. And either they will be let out on some early release, which is oftentimes, if you kill the police officer, not one of the options, or that you will get out through nefarious means. But that person could get out again. Yeah, Wesley. Wesley and then Shoshana.
Okay, I think it's significant that we're in a theater right here. When we're talking about matters that we've been talking about the Orestia. That was a play about both vengeance and justice. When it was written and performed, it was performed in a civic place where the entire community came together and basically saw the yield of this play, which was that there is no such thing as justice. There is no such thing as vengeance. It's all unsatisfactory. And as I'm listening to us...
But what about at the very end when Athena says to the Furies, I'm going to give you justice, and it's going to be predictable, and it's going to be rational, and it's going to be formal. And I'm, you know, if anybody has the words, I'm happy. So there's this moment, Wesley. I'm hoping that you also see where the audience said, ooh, we could have justice in our temple. Yeah.
The play has to be continuing to be performed in order for that to work. That's all I'm saying.
Yes.
And I'm asking if what we're doing here is not a kind of art that we're trying to make. And it's an art that our country seems to lack. Where's our tragedy? That can, I mean, we got a comedy right now, but but there's no. I'm sorry.
No, Wesley, that is so beautiful. And I'm sorry I cut you off because I just wanted to make sure that Athena got her little moment in the sun. But you're absolutely right. This is what, like, look at us right now, coming out on a beautiful day to talk about issues which we know are really, really hard issues to deal with. We're speaking in public. We're raising our hands and being willing to talk to each other about very, very hard things. And I think, Wesley, you said it absolutely right. We are creating some art here. This is a form of civic art. We're trying to figure it out together. And yeah, I desperately think that we need more of this as opposed to, you know, hiding.
The word you're looking for is catharsis.
Catharsis, yeah, Shoshana.
I'm thinking of what seems to me to be a major, contradiction. A lot of people who are against the death penalty or who are against abortion have no trouble with war. To me, war is the ultimate, it's mass murder. And I'm reminded of a button I have at home, one of those protesting buttons that says, if you kill one person, it's murder. If you kill 100,000 people, it's foreign policy.
Right.
And it's the contradiction of our society that bothers me the most, our willingness to go to war.
Yeah.
And here we are nibbling around the edges of, do we kill this individual or that individual? We get very widespread about it when we're talking about killing people in other countries for whatever slight we feel they have done to us, whatever crime we feel they have done to us, whatever injustice we feel they have done to us. We are willing to slaughter them en masse.
Exactly, yeah. And I took the moment, Shoshana, just to stick this back on the board, because this is what states, and I think, Steve, in the very beginning of the series on Good Class, you're like, well, I don't know if I want to be on the level of nations and states, and I want to be on the level of people, and we're going to be thinking about human tragedy and all that sort of thing, and or we're going to be talking about human beings. And I teach political theory, so because obviously I think that the states are important, but because I get worried about no states, but others may disagree with me. And the big argument is this is what a state is. I'm not going to dispute that definition. I think that's absolutely right. So then, what does it mean when we're giving this thing a monopoly on the legitimate form of violence? And what is it our job, this is where the we the people is going to be so important, to say, no, it's not legitimate. You may have a monopoly on violence. And honestly, I'm not so great with this rifle we have on the property. You don't want to trust me to try and protect you with my rifle. It's not going to happen. I am much more reliant on the state to do that kind of work. I just know my comfort zone. I have a hard time with this. So I'm all for a monopoly on force, but it's legitimate. What is legitimate force? And Shoshana's point, I think, gets at it. This is a whole wide range of issues. It turns out, though, we may not all agree, because we have guns, we have abortion, and we have war and capital punishment as what constitutes legitimate, and that's going to be one of those big things. Yeah, Amr and then Charlie.
I was reminded, and when Shoshana was saying, when I first moved to Putney, Shoshana, and was about to go to the first town meeting, which Meg is now moderating, but this is many years ago, my friend said, watch out and see how people are going to bicker over $1,000, they're going to pass $1 million budget without even a discussion. So there's really interesting way in which we tend to focus on small things and just like big things just tend to fly by. So in that case, I see a general agreement that expense is all right, we need to expend, but then expense on us to one specific issue is right. So killing is not a problem, but killing here is a problem.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. Charlie, then we're wrapping up.
I just wanted to point out that we're on the verge of entering an era where we're going to be programming machines to make decisions. The autonomous driving vehicle is going to have to make a choice. Do I kill the baby with the stroller or the two people in the road? This is a good class coming down the road where we better hone our skills for.
Yes. Did everybody hear Charlie about the algorithms? There's going to be machines making these decisions. At the New England Political Science, maybe it was a Law and Society conference that I went to last year. It was kind of freaky, this panel, in which a man said the criminal justice system is so biased, it's so clearly biased, we are now going to use machines to determine what these sentences should be. People gasped. He said, look at what we've got. Look at how terrible it is right now. Let's have the machines do it and there won't be so much bias. And in Cheshire County Correctional Facility, and I'm a big friend of the superintendent there, he's doing a lot of work on criminal justice reform. He's doing a lot of work to end the war on drugs and do all these things. Well, what they've done there in their intake is all machines. They're not doing face-to-face intake. They're giving somebody a computer screen, and the person fills in the questionnaire, and then that determines what kind of services they're going to get while they're behind bars. And if there's an element to that, I'm thinking, that's terrible. He says we have been so prejudiced in the past. We have been so biased in the past. Maybe the machines will be more just.
Who's going to feed the machines?
Who's going to feed the machines? Yeah. So I'm sorry to do this, but I'm a real stickler for time. It's noon, and the next class will have a lot more time for this back and forth, and I'm hoping that we will try some good clashes role play. So we will do less with this machine and more with us coming on the stage and considering what would it be like to do a good clash. So anyway, thank you very much.